I'm going to talk a little bit about building today. Imagine two construction workers. They are having lunch, and one says, "I wish the day was over." And the other one says, "Well, I hope we get the job done." And these two characterize what we're going to look at. They characterize also what we find in different believers. Some do the work, but they wish it was over, and others they hope they get the job done. And the one that wishes that the day would be over, he at 5 o'clock, let's say they work until 5 o'clock, he will drop his tools and he's gone. And the other one might first finish the part that he's working on and maybe clean his tools so that the next day he can begin freshly. So there is a different motivation and a different mindset. And let's say that the two are making a wall. Then when someone passes, you see them do the same work. Seemingly, it is exactly the same. And but if you ask each one of them, what are you doing? The first one, the one who is the first one to be home at the end of the day, he will say, "I am laying bricks." That's what I do. I lay bricks. The other one, when you ask, "What are you doing?" he will say, "I'm building a house." Although they do the same work. So the one sees only the immediate. He sees only what's right in front of him. And the other one, he sees the result. That is, he has, as it were, a relationship with the result, with the end of his work. That is actually his motivation. That is why he doesn't say at lunch, "Oh, I wish it was over." He wishes that he gets the job done. So the whole motivation, whole mindset is different. And of course, I use this picture to show different types of believers. We find ourselves often in this mindset that we see only what's right in front of us, and we forget the end, the result of all that we are doing. So the question is, what are we? Are we bricklayers or are we builders? And so what I want to do is look at Jesus' example in this, and it is a very familiar piece of scripture, but we will look at it from a slightly different angle today. It is found in John 4, verses 3 through 8. It says, "He," that's Jesus, "left Judea and departed again into Galilee. And he must needs to go through Samaria. Then cometh he to a city of Samaria, which is called Sychar, near to the parcel of ground that Jacob gave to his son Joseph. Now Jacob's well was there, and Jesus therefore, being wearied with his journey, sat thus on the wall, and it was about the 6th hour. There cometh a woman of Samaria to draw water, and Jesus said unto her, Give me to drink. For his disciples were gone away unto the city to buy meat. Okay, we have a few things here. Actually, we didn't read the first verse, but you can see that Jesus' ministry was getting more and more attention of the Pharisees, and that they were beginning to cause trouble, discord. And so Jesus decides to go to Galilee, and in order to avoid problems, because it was not yet the time for him to really clash with the Jews. This would happen, of course, much later, towards the end of his ministry. So they go to Galilee. Now, when you read this, you think, okay, they go from Judea to Galilee. But it's always interesting to look on the map, and you see that Judea is where we find Bethlehem, and Galilee is way up north, where the Sea of Galilee is, Tiberias, and this is about 100 kilometers. So if you do that on foot, if you would walk constantly with a firm pace, it would take you maybe 20 hours. So with rest and with not asphalt roads and everything, it might easily be doubles. It's quite a journey to do on foot. So maybe you want to check it on the map. You see get a bit idea where it is. So when we read that he was tired, you can imagine where they were is about halfway at this well. So they had about 50 kilometers in their feet. Now, we know that he met this woman, and there is this conversation, and I want to skip this for now and go to verse 30, because that is when his disciples return from buying food. And it says, and they went out of the city and came unto him. In the meantime, while his disciples asked him, saying, Master, eat. But he said unto them, I have meat to eat that you know not of. Therefore said the disciples one to another, Had any man brought him aught to eat? And Jesus said unto them, My meat is to do the will of him that sent me, and to finish his work. So this is a very curious thing that happens here. Now the shortest route to go from Judea to Galilee is through Samaria. But usually the Jews did not take that route because they were not very on good standing with the Samaritans. So they would usually go around that area. But in this case, Jesus went through Samaria. And it says actually he needed to go through, or here in King James it says, verse 4, he must needs to go through Samaria. So he was compelled, he was urged, he was led to go through this area. And he was obedient to what the Spirit, what God told him to do. So he went through an area that he knew might be problematic. And of course we see that this was for a purpose, because something beautiful happens here in the end. But this is the first thing we see. So the route they take, it's the shortest, but it is not the most obvious route they would take as Jews. And then they reach Jacob's well, it's mentioned there, Jacob's well. So what is Jacob's well? Just to remind us, let's go back to Genesis 33 in verse 19. That is where we actually find the story of Jacob. And it says there, and he, that is Jacob, bought a parcel of field where he had spread his tent at the hand of the children of Hamor, Shechem's father, for 100 pieces of money. And he erected there an altar and called it El Elohe Israel. That is the place where now, ages later, Jesus comes. Now, El Elohe, Israel, it means God. El, God, the God of Israel. That is what is being declared there. And Jacob does it. Jacob, who is renamed to Israel, and whose sons are, of course, the fathers of the tribes. We see there, by the way, it's El Elohe. So we find the word El for God, because all of this is prior, of course, to the story of Moses. It is only to Moses that God first reveals himself as Yahweh, as I am. And from that moment on we find the phrase Yah in names. Before that it is El. It's the more general annotation for God. El can also point to other gods. They would also be El. We find it, of course, in Genesis 1, Elohim, that's the plural. But it is made clear here, it's El, it's God, but it is also Elohe Israel. It's the God of Israel. It is that God. And so in that same place, Jesus now is going to actually say the same thing. Because if you read the conversation he has with this Samaritan woman, he tells her exactly the same. You do not know who you worship. But it is actually the God of Israel. And so he declares the same that Jacob did long before. Then, so that's the place. So then we see, it says in verse 6, back to John 4, and it was the 6th hour. Now this it's also interesting to understand what time this actually was. The 6th hour, the day, of course, begins at sunset, the evening before, and then actually the 4 watches begin, the watches through the night, which each of them lasts 3 hours, so you have basically 12 hours span until the morning. But it is from the 4th watch on that they begin to count the hours of the day. That is actually when it begins to get light. So that is around 6 o'clock. So the 6th hour would be 12 o'clock. That's noon. That's the 6th hour. You read, for example, at the arrest of Jesus, it says it was a 3rd hour. You know, it's around 9 o'clock in the morning. So it was around noon. So they had probably been walking the whole morning. They were obviously hungry and tired, and so that's why the disciples went to town to get some food. But it says here, Jesus was wearied with his journey. Now that's a bit deceptive translation, I would say. It's not so bad, but the impression you get from this is he was tired from the journey. Which, again, he probably was, because they had walked quite a distance already. But was his tiredness really from the journey? If you read the Greek word that is being used here for being tired, is from the root kopiao, which it means actually to be worn out, to be depleted. It's to be wearied, as it says here in King James, is actually an understatement. He was worn out, he was drained from energy, and this word, kopiao, it comes from kopos, which means toil, work, hard work. So it implies that the tiredness is from work, not from walking, not from traveling, but from work. So that is actually what it says here. He was worn out, depleted from energy from his work, from his ministry. On top of that, of course, he was also tired from walking. This is only normal. But there is a deeper thing here. His work was actually making him tired. And it is the Apostle John who in several places points to Jesus' struggle with against his humanity. And this we see it here also. He was fully man. And if we read from Hebrews 4 verse 15, it says there, "For we have not a high priest which cannot be touched with the feeling of our infirmities." It's not someone who does not understand our shortcomings, but he was in all points tempted like as we are, yet without sin. So on all points, he was tempted like we are. When he had to walk 100 kilometers, he would be tired just like we were, and hungry, etc. And his feet would be sore and hurting. He was in everything like we are. He was fully man. And it is in particular the Apostle John who emphasizes this in certain points throughout his gospel. But what it says there in Hebrews 4 verse 15 is, "Yet without sin." It is exactly these things, these infirmities that we suffer, that will lead us easily to compromise, to fail, and even to sin. It is that bricklayer who says, "I wish the day was over." He is the first one to compromise. If there is any chance to stop, to have a break, he will take that chance. That is when you give in to the physical and even mental fatigue that can overcome. But it says Jesus was yet, in spite of all this, he was without sin. He did not allow this tiredness for him to compromise on his work. And especially he was tired because of his work. That is what the word used there implies. So now you would think this is the chance for him to not work. First of all, he's in Samaria. This is not a place where Jews interact with the people. His disciples go to town to to buy food, so they will be away for a while. He's at the well. What would any one of us probably do? Sit down and take a nap and just rest. You don't need to do anything now. No work. You can rest. And what does Jesus do? He does exactly that of which he is so tired, depleted from all energy. He is going to minister to this Samaritan woman. He's doing his work. It is exactly the opposite from what you would expect. And the strange thing is that when his disciples return and they say, "Here is food, eat, please eat," they've seen how tired Jesus was, he doesn't take it. They find a whole different Jesus who is not tired anymore and actually says, I have other meat, I have other food. King James uses here the word meat. Don't take this literal as meat from an animal, but it just means food. He says, I have meat to eat that you know not of. And then they wonder, did someone else give him food in the meantime? But he says, my meat is to do the will of him that sent me and to finish his work. He mentions two things that are his meat, his food. One is to do the will of the Father, and the second thing is to finish the work. It's one thing to do the work, it's another thing to finish the work. It is the bricklayer who is just laying bricks, or it is the builder who is actually building a house. That is the work that he wants to finish. He wants to build a house and not just lay a few bricks. Now, we have looked at this verse before, maybe you remember, because in the Jewish context, this has a way deeper meaning. My meat is to do the will of him that sent me. It actually points to the sacrificial system. Jesus is bringing here a meat offering. And we looked at this. There are 5 different types of offering, of sacrifice that you can bring, and one of them is the meat offering. And again, don't take it literal, it's a food offering. It's not meat in the sense of flesh from an animal. So if we go briefly to Leviticus chapter 2, verses 1 and 2, we will actually see this where this meat offering comes from. It says there, and when any will offer a meat offering unto the Lord, this is, by the way, important what it says. If any will offer, which means if you want to do it, it is a completely voluntary offering. Other sacrifices, they have to be done. They are obligatory, like the sin offering. You have to do it, but this is voluntary. If you want to do it, then his offering shall be of fine flour, and he shall pour oil upon it, and put frankincense thereon. And he shall bring it to Aaron's sons, the priests, and he shall take thereout his handful of flour therefore, and the oil thereof, with all the frankincense thereof, and the priest shall burn the memorial of it upon the altar, to be an offering made by fire, of a sweet savour unto the Lord. So this specific type of offering is the purpose of it is what it says here in the end of verse 2. It is a sweet savor unto the Lord. It is to please the Lord. That is the purpose of this offering. And that is why it is a voluntary offering. You bring it when you feel you should do it. God doesn't say you have to every day do this to please me. We have free will in this. So that is, but this offering is, of course, God didn't give this to the Israelites back then just to keep them busy or to give them another activity, but it's a shadow of something. And Jesus is here showing of what this was a shadow. If any will offer a meat offering, if you want to do it, Jesus wanted to do the will of the Father. That is what he says, that is my meat, that is what I want to do. So if you do so, then that is a sweet savor unto the Lord. The meat offering, contrary to what especially the English translation might imply, it is an offering, as we just read from Leviticus, that does not involve animal sacrifice. There is no death in this sacrifice. There is no blood in this sacrifice. And that is an important thing. That means that it is a living sacrifice. So when the scripture speaks about a living sacrifice, it points to the meat offering, to the voluntary offering that you bring to please the Lord. It is not like the sin offering where the sin has to be atoned for and blood has to be shed. That is a whole different thing. That is not what Jesus is doing. He will do this, of course, ultimately at the end of his, the last act of his ministry. But here he is bringing a meat offering. And so that's why he says, my meat is to do the will of the one who sent me. I'm bringing a meat offering here. And Paul explains this also later in his letter to the Romans, chapter 12, verse 1. He says, I beseech you therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy, acceptable unto God, which is your reasonable service. He speaks here about a living sacrifice. That means it's a meat offering. It is, and by no means pointing to the sacrifice that Jesus brought on the cross. Has nothing to do with that. I have heard a pastor preach about this verse, speaking about the lamb on the altar and the sweet savor of the roasting meat that was sweet savor to the Lord. This is such a complete wrong picture, which you can only say if you have not looked at what the Old Testament tells about the sacrificial system. This pastor was probably thinking about a nice barbecue, but it has really nothing to do with this. Presenting yourself as a living sacrifice means exactly what Jesus explains here, to do the will of the Father. That is presenting yourself as a living sacrifice. That is sweet odor to the Lord. That is what gives him pleasure. And the result of that that how God answers this is that it makes us transcend beyond our limitations, and it is actually best reflected in Isaiah in chapter 40. The last part there, from verse 28, where it says, Hast thou not known, hast thou not heard, that the everlasting God, the Lord, the Creator of the ends of the earth, fainteth not, neither is weary. There is no searching in his understanding. He giveth power to the faint, and to them that have no might he increaseth strength. Even the youth shall faint and be weary, and the young man shall utterly fail. But they that wait upon the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings as eagles. They shall run and not be weary, and they shall walk and not faint. And it's exactly what we see happening here. Jesus brings a meat offering, and what happens? God renews his strength. He makes him mount up. To do the will of the Father is what should give us the fire to move and to do even more than we think even possible. And he enables us to do so. It is not so much to do the will of the Father, but it is actually that, as Jesus says, I may do the will of the Father. It's a privilege. You may do it, and it's exactly also what in the meat offering in Leviticus 2 implies. If you want to do it, you have the privilege to do it, but it's up to you to actually do it, to do the will of the Father. And that privilege that God when we do answer to that pleases the Lord, and He blesses us, especially in giving us strength beyond our physical limitations. So that's one thing. The second thing that he adds to that, Jesus, is and to finish the work. It's not only doing the work, but it is finishing the work. You do the work in order to reach a goal. The one is laying the bricks because he wants to finish the house, not just because he wants to lay bricks. That is not a goal in itself. And here again the translation is not so strong as it should be, because it says and to finish his work. It should actually say until I finish the work. That is what it should say. We continue until it's finished, not to finish, but until it's finished. That's when we find rest. Well, we need our lifetime to do so, but that is what our motivation should be. We continue until we are finished. And so here you see the difference between this bricklayer and builder, again, to use this picture once again. To do the will of the Father is laying bricks. But to finish the work, that is building. That's the difference there. The one who lays bricks, he might at 5 o'clock say, well, now I call it a day, this is it, I'm going to rest now. That is what Jesus could have done. He could have taken a nap there until the disciples would return. This is what the bricklayer does. And so many Christians, they are bricklayers. They do the work, but only so far. When there is a chance to do something else or to have a break, then they leave it. They're not focused on finishing. But the builder, he's aimed at the result. He does not focus on his tiredness. He does not focus on the clock. He focuses on to finish the job. And he's even ready to do that extra stretch of work. That is his motivation. Now Paul uses also this difference, but he uses a different picture. He compares it with running a race. And it's a very similar thing. I was thinking of this. You can look at two people that are running, but one might, if you just take a snapshot, you will see that no difference. But if you know the reality, then one might be just jogging while the other is running a marathon. So the one who's jogging, he's doing the same thing. He's also running, but he has no pressure of time. He has no finish line that he needs to reach. He's just giving himself some movement. The other one, he is aimed at the finish. His goal is to reach the finish, and not only to reach the finish, but to reach the finish first of all the others. He wants to be a winner. And so that is what Paul uses in 1 Corinthians in chapter 9. So Paul is just showing here a different picture of what Jesus has taught. Sorry, verse 24, that's where I want to go. Yeah. Know you not that they which run in a race run all, but one receiveth the prize, so run that you may obtain. Run in order to win, to be the first to reach the finish. And not just as if you are just jogging. So the one who's running a race and he wants to win, he doesn't even have in his mind the thought of resting. Although he might feel so tired and everything in his body might hurt at some point, but he moves on because he wants to win. And in fact, if you watch a marathon or another race where athletes are running, you can see sometimes how tired they are, how they are fighting against what their body is trying to tell them. But then when they see the finish approaching, somehow there is more energy and they even speed up to be the first for this final spurt. So that is a picture of how it works. When we have the finish, the completion of the work before us, it actually boosts us to reach to that with even more strength. So there is two things: the will of the Father, and also here in 1 Corinthians, Paul speaks about this, and that was verse 19, verse 16 actually. For though I preach the gospel, I have nothing to glory of. For necessity is laid upon me. Yeah, woe is unto me if I preach not the gospel. So that is his work. That is his commission. It's also our commission, but you can also have different commissions that Jesus lays upon you or God lays upon you at a certain moment in time, but that is his commission, to preach the gospel. And he says it's a necessity. It's what I have to do, what I'm being told to do. Just as we read in John 4, that Jesus felt the need to go through Samaria. He was compelled to do so. So here Paul says, it's a necessity. I have to do this. So that's the work. But not just to do it, to finish it. In verse 27 he says, but I keep under my body and bring it into subjection, lest that by any means, when I have preached to others, I myself should be a castaway. So here he says, I'm not giving in to what my body calls me to do. Again, it's the same what we see in what Jesus did. He did not take a nap and have his rest, to which, humanly spoken, he was fully entitled, and he could have done so, but no. Instead, he used this time to also do the work. And so this is what Paul also says here. I will not use my physical limitations, even mental limitations, to compromise and to fail or even fall into sin. So it shows us that we should not let opportunities go by. And so while the disciples were out buying food, actually serving the flesh, that's what they were doing. In the meantime, Jesus was doing the Father's work. He was evangelizing, and that was his meat, as he says. And indeed, he was re-energized because of this. The result, by the way, if you read the rest there of John 4, is that many came to faith in Samaria. So it was quite a thing against all odds, because there were Samaritans. Normally Jews would not even speak to them. They would travel all the way around them. A much longer journey, but to avoid these people. Jesus was building. Romans 15 verse 20. Paul writes, so I have strived to preach the gospel, not where Christ was named, but lest I should build upon another man's foundation. Here you see again Paul uses also the metaphor of building. We are building, and you build, of course, on a foundation. How did Jesus do this? And how should we do it? And Paul also confirms this in obedience. Again, Jesus felt the need, he had to go through Samaria. It was in obedience that he did so. And it was in obedience that he spoke to this woman the things that he spoke, instead of just taking some water and taking a nap. Psalm 127 says, except the Lord build a house, they labor in vain that build it. So it has to be in obedience and in following the Lord, and not because it's our own building that we are actually building. It's quite a thing, and just as one who plans to build a house, he makes a plan first, and he counts the costs. And if you do so, you have to also be ready to pay these costs. And then, back to the spiritual, you deny the flesh, you deny the world, because you know if you give in to that, you will fail. And your aim is to finish. So in Luke 14, Jesus speaks there and he says, if any man come to me and hate not his father and mother and wife and children and brethren and sisters, and his own life also, he cannot be my disciple. So you're going to build. You have to deny many things. And whosoever doth not bear his cross and come after me cannot be my disciple. For which of you, intending to build a tower, sitteth not down first and counted the cost? So here you have it. He compares this commission that we have, this being his disciple, with building a tower or building. You sit down first, you count the costs, whether you have sufficient to finish it. To finish it, not to build, but to finish. Lest haply after he had laid the foundation, he is not able to finish it, and all that behold it begin to mock him, saying, this man began to build and was not able to finish. That is the shame if you do it the wrong way. So, in all this, this is what we must have before us. We must be builders, not bricklayers. It might be very nice and give you a nice feeling to lay a brick or a few bricks, but that is not what is being asked from us. It is asked from us to finish that which we are given to do. So we have to be builders, not bricklayers. We have to count the costs, we have to deny the flesh, and aim to finish. Amen.